Tank, healer, damage dealer. These are the three all-encompassing archetypes that can be found in an ever-increasing number of games, from MMOs to shooters to strategy games and even sports games. If you've ever played a game that has more than one character running around at once, chances are you've become familiar with this dynamic because it's basically everywhere. Designers have taken to calling this set of three roles the Holy Trinity, because it doesn't just underpin the design of some of the biggest and most successful games ever, but many wouldn't work at all without a tank, a support, and a damage dealer to build everything from combat to crafting around. In fact, the Holy Trinity design is so useful and so ubiquitous that a lot of people really hate it, but I'm getting ahead of myself there. For those who don't know, here's how the Holy Trinity works in the broadest possible terms. In a game that was designed with the Holy Trinity in mind, as well as some that weren't, all possible classes, characters, and roles fall into one of three distinct archetypes, each with their own jobs and function. They are the damage dealer, the tank, and the support. I only said healer earlier because it rhymed. The damage dealer is responsible for, you guessed it, dealing damage, and are tasked with actually defeating the enemy as well as controlling the momentum of any given encounter. Supports are kind of the opposite. Rather than attacking the enemy, a support exists to ensure the rest of their team can do their job unhindered. Finally, we have the somewhat confusingly named tank. Contrary to its name, a tank isn't a force of destruction, but a force of defense and control, protecting their team while also stopping the enemy from achieving their goals. Yes, the name's confusing, but what are you gonna do? You may not have heard about the Holy Trinity before, but you've definitely seen it in action. The classic RPG party lineup of a thief damage dealer, a warrior tank, and a supporting cleric has been around in RPGs since the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons, but the Trinity goes back even further than that. In football, or my preferred alternative, Rocket League, the striker is a damage dealer and scores the goals needed to win, the midfield supports their allies by setting up plays, and the keeper acts like a tank, preventing the enemy from winning. By letting people specialize into these three distinct roles, each of which work together, not only can teams or groups act much more effectively than a disorganized bunch of jacks of all trades, but newer players can ease themselves into a game by only having to focus on particular elements at once. The inherent power of the Holy Trinity allows designers to use it as a framework to build systems around as well as encourage teamwork. Without the help of tanks and supports, damage dealers are just gonna get creamed. But equally, without their damage dealer friends, the other two will be too slow and defensive to actually get anything done. Each part of the Holy Trinity only works in tandem with the other two, quickly establishing a group dynamic and allowing teams of players to be effective even with no prior communication. This all makes sense, right? So how is it that this obviously useful trick for designing group-centric games is despised by so many people? You can't go 5 minutes on the subreddit for an MMO or a hero shooter without seeing a bunch of people complaining about how healers suck and are boring, or that tanks are overpowered, or that their particular playstyle isn't viable anymore, and it's all the Holy Trinity's fault. While a certain amount of this can be attributed to internet complaining, the Trinity does have one major weakness, and it's a doozy. If anything, the Holy Trinity is a bit too effective, and this can have all kinds of negative consequences. But we'll get to Overwatch later. In the meantime, let's take a look at World of Warcraft as an example, because it's one of the games that really popularized this school of design, with talent trees that allow players to dedicate themselves to a single role, and stuff like the at the time incredibly innovative aggro system that made it much easier to get an enemy to focus on a single player. The Holy Trinity is deeply baked into WoW's core design, and that's something that's still visible today. Despite the fact that there are 12 classes with an average of 3 specializations apiece, they all slot neatly into a part of the Holy Trinity, with most classes having access to 2 of the 3 Holy Trinity archetypes. Because every specialization has precisely one job to do, it leads to a lot of homogenization of class and encounter design. Tanks never need to actually do much damage because they have 10 times the threat generation of other specs simply by virtue of being a tank. They only need to keep enemies occupied and survive, so their entire toolset is dedicated to damage reduction, stuns, and taunts, which are important, but not all that fun to use if it's all you're doing. Support only need to buff and heal, so they spend most battles playing health bar whack-a-mole because they can't meaningfully contribute in any other way, and damage dealers' only job is to do as much damage as possible as fast as they can, leading to them spamming the same completely optimized rotations through every battle, often without worrying about positioning or survivability because that's the other guy's job. Because the Holy Trinity is so strictly enforced in World of Warcraft, and every encounter is designed around these very narrow roles, it leads to a gradual erasure of individual playstyles. Class toolsets are either very sparse and utilitarian, or stuffed with a bunch of irrelevant junk that doesn't help them do their job and thus feels useless, even if it is fun to use. If some of a damage dealer's kit takes the form of some weird utility skills that don't directly increase their damage, then they're instantly less valuable than one that only does the single job they're required to do. Over time, this leads to all classes of a given archetype feeling more or less the same, because they're only ever judged by a single metric. In effect, if the Holy Trinity is allowed to become too powerful, it begins to suffocate everything that doesn't directly support it. The gravitational pull of the Holy Trinity can also extend to single-player content. In Outriders, a looty-shooty game with a tank class, a support class, and 2 flavors of damage dealer, I made the mistake of picking the Technomancer, the support. The game is built around combat that rewards aggression and quick close-quarters skirmishes. Unfortunately, by virtue of being a support class, all I had were heals, fire support abilities, and buffs to sniper damage. This led to some fairly boring gameplay where I just sorta hid behind my summonable turrets waiting for my one damage dealing ability to come off cooldown, because my health and damage were too low to play the game as intended, and half my skills weren't very useful against packs of melee boys who were clearly intended to be handled by a tank. Now, you might be saying at this point, well, if the Holy Trinity style of design doesn't work for a game, then the developers don't have to use it, right? And if the players don't want to be pigeonholed into a particular strategy, then they can come up with their own one, with blackjack and hookers. The thing is, escaping the influence of the Holy Trinity can be harder than you'd expect. Guild Wars 2, for example, was designed to explicitly defy the usual class archetypes, giving everyone the ability to heal and requiring that all players dodge enemy attacks. As far as solo content was concerned, this was a huge success, allowing all players to self-sufficiently progress through the story regardless of their build. However, when dungeons and the later raid content was introduced, it was a different story. In spite of the devs' best efforts, players naturally gravitated into the archetypal roles because having dedicated healers and dedicated tanks was still more efficient, as it allowed everyone else to focus on damage, allowing for quicker and more reliable clears. Even if the game lacked an aggro system and in many ways outright resisted this kind of playstyle, the Holy Trinity still made itself known, and probably not for the better. This of course begs the question of what can actually be done about this? If the Holy Trinity is going to be a factor in any game that involves multiple roles and will assert itself whether we want to or not, how can designers stop virtually every game from feeling the same, and how does this create different gameplay experiences? Well, the easiest way to change the ways that the Holy Trinity can manifest is to alter the relative power of its components, drastically shifting how various strategies and team dynamics form. For example, in Fire Emblem, as well as many other tactics games, enemies have 2 defensive stats. In this case, defense, which resists physical damage, and resistance, which defends against magical damage. Hang on. This is a fairly substantial nerf to damage dealers, as units usually only deal one type of damage, meaning they'll only be effective against roughly half of units. Not only does this help to mitigate players relying on a single unkillable mega unit, but it also creates some interesting tactical play where assigning units against appropriate enemies can drastically increase their effectiveness, and countering enemy forces correctly requires you to be constantly cycling your tanks so your big armored boys don't get obliterated by a few spells. Altering the power of various parts of the Trinity can also work asymmetrically. In the Total War Warhammer games, certain factions, like the Dwarves, have incredibly well defended but slow armies that prioritize tanking over dealing damage, meaning that you've got to find a way to break their formation or draw them out if you want to win. Similarly, the Vampire Counts and Tomb Kings sport powerful support units in the form of their heroes and magic ghost cards, giving their units insane buffs. This means that playing as an undead faction is often less about directly crushing the enemy and more about protecting your leader, because if they die, your army will crumble. Literally. Of course, that's not to say that one character can only ever embody a single role. Many games have hybrid classes that can perform more than one job in the Trinity. Not only does this give players more to do, but it can also encourage more dynamic team interactions as players cooperate and compete organically rather than just working off a script. In Deep Rock Galactic, for example, no individual class is the tank, support, or the damage dealer. Instead, all of them are capable of outputting decent damage, they all have some sort of defensive crowd control in the form of terrain manipulation, slowing grenades or deployable shields, and they all possess some form of support, like powerful flares, platforms, or zip lines. This creates some fantastic team play as players shift organically between different roles depending on the situation, ensuring that encounters always feel fresh and the group dynamic never stagnates, because clever use of everyone's entire toolset is needed to win. Of course, this is just stretching and manipulating the Holy Trinity to get more interesting results. How can games actually try to move beyond it? Well, the key to conquering the Holy Trinity lies in understanding what it really represents. Namely, the three different kinds of interaction that any one player needs to worry about: ally to enemy, enemy to ally, and ally to ally. If you're a super cool professional gamer like I am, you'll have figured out that these three correspond to damage dealer, tank, and support. Damage dealers are all about interacting with the enemy, tanks are all about controlling the ways the enemy can interact with your team, and supports interact almost exclusively with other members of their team. Therefore, if a game can create a distinct layer of gameplay for characters to interact with that's neither good guy nor bad guy, the effect of the Trinity becomes less pronounced or shifts into a sort of holy square. For example, games with systemic mechanics, or in fact any game that lets players interact with the environment, creates an entirely new axis of interaction, distinct from the ally-enemy dichotomy. In Divinity Original Sin, not only can players do all the classic RPG stuff like dealing damage, controlling enemies, and supporting your allies, but they can also interact with the environment. This could mean cleansing harmful effects from the ground around your team, or creating beneficial ones, allowing you to gain a positional advantage as well as set up combos, with oil that can be set on fire or water which conducts lightning. A character focused around terrain manipulation, teleporting objects around and creating elemental surfaces plays the game in a fundamentally different way to the classical archetypes, because their primary vector of interaction is with the environment rather than enemies or players, as they struggle for map control and longer term tactical advantages. The best example of this is the rain spell, which basically just creates a bunch of water in a huge area. This doesn't do much of anything on its own, but instead alters and interacts with the game's other systems, cleansing oil and poison, reducing everyone's lightning resistance, and even changing the properties of some attacks. It could be argued that this spell serves a damage, support, and a tanking purpose, but in reality, it and other moves like it are kind of their own thing, dealing with the more logistical and strategic side of the game that slowly bleeds into the turn-by-turn tactical stuff over time. Adding a fourth axis of interaction is also the reason why games with an economic element can remain interesting even when most of their combat leans heavily on the Holy Trinity. In real-time strategy games like Starcraft, sure, you spend most of your time fighting it out with a mix of damage, tanky, and support units, but they are inescapably reliant on the foundation of economic elements like workers and buildings. Mastering Starcraft isn't just about mastering individual battles, but how to create an economy capable of producing your armies in the first place. Units like Zerg Queens might be slow, expensive, and fairly unthreatening, but the fact that they can allow you to spawn units more quickly makes them one of the most powerful units in the game, even if they rarely actually fight. Aeon of Strife rip-off games like Dota do this as well. Many characters, like Spectre, Faceless Void, and the hero who shall forever be known as Skeleton King, don't offer much at level 1, but scale exponentially into the late game through items, allowing the game to be won on economic terms rather than tactical ones. Similarly, heroes that excel at killing AI-controlled creeps and destroying towers like Tinker, Alchemist, and Broodmother often don't engage in teamfights at all, instead generating economic value for their team and threatening a win through the axis of ally versus environment rather than ally versus enemy. The thing to remember though is that no matter how hard developers and players fight it, games will always be influenced by overarching meta-level tactics and universal strategic principles. Even if it were possible to have a team game completely escape from the Holy Trinity, it probably wouldn't be for the better. Compare Fortnite, which has almost no formal trinity, to Apex Legends, which has a medium strength one, with each character and their abilities falling loosely into one of the three roles. As a result, teamfights in Fortnite are mostly uncoordinated free-for-alls where everyone just sort of does their own thing and hopes for the best. But in Apex, characters have clearly defined roles and it leads to much more interesting team play. Support characters like Crypto can scout ahead and help the team plan out an ambush, tanky characters like Gibraltar can lay down covering fire while the team advances, and aggressive damage dealers like Fuse can lay the smackdown. Simply by suggesting roles to players and giving them abilities that require teamwork to make the most of, sophisticated tactics can evolve naturally, and it wouldn't be possible without considering the Holy Trinity. Similarly, finding ways to make the restrictions imposed by high-level strategies interesting can lead to some incredibly unique and compelling design. In turn-based games, for example, going first is almost always better as it gives you control over the pace of the game. So, rather than give one player an advantage, many tabletop games, like 5 Tribes, allow you to bid against other players for priority on the turn order, turning a balance problem into an interesting strategic part of play that forces you to weigh up control over the game with economic benefit. High-level strategies like the Holy Trinity exist for a very good reason. They're a fantastic scaffolding for both developers and players to build from, allowing them to create something unique, rooted in a formula that always works. These sorts of strategies only become a problem when they stop acting as a guide and a foundation and instead begin to restrict how games can be designed and played. Nintendo might have a rock-solid 4-step formula for designing levels, but ones that follow the steps without adding any extra texture are some of the most forgettable. And Telltale might have stumbled onto a great narrative structure in the form of branching and reconverging paths, but once we figured out that our choices don't really matter and all the games were structured in the same way, the illusion was forever broken. Similarly, in the case of Overwatch, yet another Blizzard game with a Trinity addiction, the characters were originally sorted into 4 categories, with damage dealers split into offense and defense. This encouraged players to focus more on taking and holding objectives through a combination of the two, rather than on just murdering each other. However, the pull of the Holy Trinity was too strong, and players insisted on playing both offense and defense characters like straight up aggressive damage dealers, outright ignoring characters who could play more defensively, provide map awareness, or use their mobility to their advantage. Instead of continuing to push their intended playstyle, Blizzard gradually backed down until they merged both roles into a single massive group. While this is what players wanted, I think Overwatch is less unique for it. With so many interesting characters like the stealthy Disabler Sombra, the teleporting Symmetra, and my beautiful child Bastion, permanently relegated to the realms of total uselessness because they were designed for a game that, in effect, doesn't really exist anymore. The games that use the Holy Trinity best are the ones that add to it or mess around with it in order to give us familiar gameplay in a brand new context, and the ones that use it badly sacrifice their interesting gameplay in order to strengthen the boring tank support damage dealer dynamic that we've seen a million times before. I guess what I'm saying, kids, is that the Bible is kinda like the original World of Warcraft. Jesus is my tank, the Holy Spirit is my healer, and you can bet that my boy Yahweh is going to smite your heretic asses for worshipping at the false idol of video games. Yeah, that's right, I made the obvious joke and it only took me 17.5 minutes. How'd you like that? Well, if it isn't my old friend, the after the video bit. Yeah. Hi, how you doing? This is a little ending segment I do where I promote a cool internet person, shamelessly beg you to support my livelihood, and also say thanks to the people who've done that already. Let's start with that first bit, and with Laura Kate Dale, a fantastic video game journalist and accessibility advocate who produces some of the most well-researched and insightful videos and articles on the subject I've ever seen. Were that not enough, she also released a book called Things I Learned About Mario's Butt that is hilarious and absolutely worth a read. But before you go and have a look at Laura's channel, we're not done yet. If you would like to support me and my endeavours, then please do share the channel / this video on social media, give me a like, a comment, a subscribe, and all that jazz. Alternatively, you could also support me on Patreon, where a bunch of fantastic people help me make more content each and every month, and in return, they get bonus content, my permanent permission to use adblock on my videos, as well as some special shoutouts. My top tier supporters in particular earn the dubious honour of me saying their name at the end of a video, as well as me telling you how cool they are. Seriously, they are super cool. If I weren't already married to video games, the things I'd do to them. They are Alex Deloche, Alex Vieira, Andrew Labrano, Asaran, Ashley Shade, Alsakav, Brennan Spalling, Brian Notariani, Konstantina Punkt, Cosmix360, Daniel Metjes, David Senser, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Egton, Edward Franklin Woods, Eugene Bulkin, Evie, Gazkul, Gretar Hannison, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Joey Bruno, Jordan Gear, George Aria Navarro, Joshua Binswanger, Kai Gillespie, Lee Berman, Lucas Slack, Mace Window 54, Max Filipov, NWDD, Nate Graff, Patrick Romberg, Pavel Yaros, Philby the Bilby, Prospero, Petter Sasbo Daniel, Redadex, Regal Regex, Ray's Dad, Sheldon Hearn, Simon Jacobson, Steve Riley, Strategy and Ultima, The Forbidden Shrimp, Tyler Duncan, Zach Grendel, and ciao. Thank you for watching, thanks for bearing with me, and I will see you around. Bye!